What if I told you fear could be a deadly weapon, a weapon that gripped entire continents in an iron fist, subjugated whole peoples, and came for you? Today, we plunge into the darkest, most brutal chapter of human history, an era where a single doubt and careless word or even a glance could turn life into a living hell, the era of the Inquisition. Imagine a world where faith wasn't a comfort but a blade, and where power and religion were twisted into a monstrous alliance, where neighbors betrayed neighbors, and those who called themselves servants of God concocted the most exquisite tortures. Have you ever wondered why people were, really, burned at the stake? What devilish contraptions were born in the minds of the executioners? Why could even innocent beauty or a clean shirt on a Sunday spell a death sentence? We will uncover the horrifying secrets of this ruthless machine, trace its bloody path from the dusty roads of Europe to the sinister tribunals of the New World. The stories you are about to hear will shock you to your core. This will be a journey into the very heart of darkness, where human cruelty reached its terrifying peak. Prepare yourself, because the truth about the Inquisition might just shatter everything you thought you knew about the past. Hold on tight, we're starting, Today, we plunge into a chilling history, the history of the Inquisition. It's a tale of a time when fear seeped into every home, and faith became the most terrifying weapon in the hands of those who craved power. Imagine an era where one careless word spoken out of turn could bring men in long black robes with faces carved from stone right to your door. We'll expose the horrifying secrets, why people were burned alive, what devilish contraptions were born in the minds of torturers, and why even innocent beauty could spell a death sentence. This will be a journey to a time and place where every glance, every whispered word, could cost you your life. We often picture the Inquisition as smoking pyres, grim dungeons, and crowds of fanatics with wild-eyed stares. But behind that chilling facade lay a cold, calculated system, operating with all the spectacle of a grand theater production. The Inquisitors built a machine that kept entire cities under a constant state of dread. One person could knock on another's door, whisper an accusation, and someone's fate could be shattered in an instant, forever. It all began with the most innocent little things. A strange look, a laugh too loud on a Sunday, the smell of cooking that suddenly seemed foreign to neighbors. An envious whisper could set off a chain of events that only ended at the stake. Kings and popes pulled the unseen strings, while ordinary people became pawns in their cynical game for power, cloaked in the mantle of holiness. To get a feel for the spirit of that savage age, let's look at one of the most absurd examples of early trials. In search of truth, the Inquisitors devised the infamous trial by water. A person was tightly bound like a sack, thrown into the nearest river, and they simply waited for the horrifying outcome. If, during this gruesome ordeal, they drowned, it meant their soul was pure. But of course, their life had already ended irreversibly at the bottom of the cold water. And if, miraculously, they somehow floated or swam, they were immediately declared guilty of collusion with the devil, and the stake awaited them with open, devouring arms. Sounds like some kind of twisted dark humor, doesn't it? But thousands of innocent people went through this nightmarish absurdity, and this was just the beginning. We will peer into the very origins of this hell, into the shadow of heresy that terrified the Almighty Church more than any plague. Walk through the grim workshops where the ropes of the rack groaned and the red-hot iron hissed. Discover how the Inquisition, this ruthless machine, shattered lives, built empires on bones, and left a bloody stain so deep even the Vatican itself would want to erase it from history. So why did this nightmare begin at all? People lived in a world where faith, dictated by the Church, literally governed their every move. What you ate, how you prayed, what you even dared to think, but dare to question even one church rule, and it was instantly seen as a mortal threat to the very foundations of the world. Heretics, as they were branded, could be anyone. Simple peasants praying in their own way, or daring scholars asking uncomfortable questions about the heavens and the stars. The Inquisitors saw them as a direct danger to the order that held society in the iron grip of obedience, and they set about their work with truly horrifying ingenuity. Wooden stocks slowly, agonizingly broke legs, and words screamed out under interrogation shattered lives forever. All for one single purpose: to keep the world in an iron leash until it crumbled under the weight of doubt and unwelcome thoughts. This is a tale of thousands whose fates were crushed under the weight of the most ridiculous accusations. of women whose natural beauty became a sinister pretext for suspicion and accusations of witchcraft, and of scientists who paid with their lives for ideas ahead of their time. We will reveal stories that make you truly ponder the grim past and show how this monstrous theater of fear impacted the entire world. Its chilling echoes have reached our time, carefully hidden away in the Vatican's secret archives. We will step behind the curtains of this bloody spectacle and see how the flames of those times, the very flames of the pyres, still illuminate our understanding of history today. So hold on tight. Ahead lie revelations that might just overturn everything you thought you knew about those bygone, seemingly distant centuries. Now let's transport ourselves to where this horror first began. The Inquisition was born in the deepest shadows of the Middle Ages, when the mighty church faced an enemy it feared more than anything on earth. And this, contrary to later legends, was not witches with brooms or devilish Sabbaths in the forests at all. It was ideas, slowly but surely undermining its absolute grip on minds. In the 12th and 13th centuries, heresy spread across Europe like a contagion. It surfaced everywhere, in small villages and bustling cities, among simple peasants and skilled artisans who suddenly began to question what the Church had held for centuries as the sole truth. Among these deviants, the Cathars and Waldensians particularly stood out. These groups challenged not just the priests, but the entire social order that rested upon church authority. The Cathars primarily lived in southern France, their stronghold in the flourishing Languedoc region. They called themselves the Pure, and adhered to a strange faith, believing the world was divided into two warring principles, absolute good and absolute evil. Good, according to their doctrine, was tied to the soul and the heavens, while evil was tied to the body and the entire material world. In their view, the church itself, with its gold, opulent temples, and lavish, expensive rituals, clearly belonged to the world of evil. They rejected the sacraments, infant baptism, Holy Communion, and even the very idea that priests were needed for soul salvation. The Cathars lived remarkably simply, often abstaining from meat and strictly adhering to a vow to shun all wealth. Their leaders, whom they called the Perfecti, traveled through villages and taught people how to save their souls without any involvement from the official church. This naturally made them incredibly dangerous in the eyes of those who held power and church wealth. The Waldensians emerged slightly later, at the end of the 12th century, and came from northern Italy. Their founder was a man named Valdez, a wealthy merchant from Lyon, who suddenly gave away all his vast possessions and decided to live strictly according to the Gospels. The Waldensians also aimed for a simplification of faith. They audaciously read the Bible in their native tongue, not the sacred Latin, and, preached without any permission from priests. They believed any believer could speak of God, not just those who wore robes. Their ideas spread quickly through villages and cities like the wind, attracting those weary of exorbitant church taxes and strict rules. The church saw this as a direct threat to its influence, and most crucially, to its control. Because if people started reading scripture and interpreting it themselves, its power, built over centuries, would inevitably weaken. This spreading heresy didn't just scare priests senseless. It also severely rattled the very foundations of medieval society. Kings and powerful feudal lords, whose authority rested on oaths of loyalty bound by faith, also depended on the church. After all, if the people stopped obeying the church, who would pay them taxes? Who would obey their laws? The Cathars and Waldensians didn't formally call for rebellion, but their ideas themselves, like a ticking time bomb, undermined the familiar, centuries-established world. Feeling threatened, the church decided to act, and act brutally. In those early years, the inquisitors weren't yet sitting at court tables with quills and massive record books. They relied on brute force and public spectacles to make it crystal clear to everyone else. Deviating from the only true rules was forbidden. Heretics were crushed with military campaigns and fire, not with long and tedious proceedings. This was a true war against ideas that threatened the very order. Early inquisitors actively used so-called ordeals or trials, which looked more like savage rituals than a real search for truth. One of the most infamous methods was the ordeal by hot iron. The suspect, trembling with fear, was handed a piece of metal, red hot, and forced to hold it in their hands. If their skin burned black and they endured this unbearable pain without a single groan or complaint, it was somehow deemed a sign of their purity before God. Burns, or even worse, cries, spoke of undeniable guilt, and the accused's fate was sealed, well, very quickly. Another favored trial was boiling water. The suspect was forced to plunge their hand directly into a cauldron of bubbling, boiling water. Then the inquisitors meticulously observed how the wounds healed. Quick recovery was considered a blessing from above, but slow healing burns, or God forbid scars, immediately pointed to their connection with the forces of darkness. These barbaric methods symbolized a kind of judgment of God, rather than a real search for truth or evidence. The inquisitors devoutly believed that higher powers themselves would miraculously sort out who was right and who was guilty. But to be fair, such savage trials weren't universally applied. More often, heretics were simply seized and led directly to the fire without further ado. These trials, in the sense we understand them today, were hardly practiced back then. It was all built on primal fear and public spectacle. People watched as the flames, like a living thing, devoured the bodies of the deviants, and believe me, that made them keep a tight lid on their tongues. Despite the persecution, the Cathars proliferated like stubborn weeds, taking hold of entire regions. Their communities lived separately, built their own faith, and local priests lost their flocks at an alarming rate. The Waldensians weren't far behind. They spread through villages, distributing their forbidden books and subversive words. The church was losing its iron grip on people's souls. Sensing it couldn't cope alone, the church called on secular power for help. Kings and powerful barons eagerly joined this game, for the lands of the heretics could become easy and highly desirable prey. One of the first documented victims of this early struggle entered the chronicles. Her name was Beatrice de Planisoles, and she lived in southern France. She was a Cathar and, crucially, refused to renounce her faith under pressure. She was seized, brought to the town square, the most crowded spot, and tied to a stake. A crowd gathered around, buzzing with wild curiosity mixed with horror. The flames, like a predator, flared, and her body vanished in the acrid smoke. This monstrous spectacle became a graphic and brutal lesson for all who dared to watch. The church unequivocally showed only one fate awaited the deviants: the fire. Such terrible scenes repeated more and more often. Heretics were burned for their words, for their thoughts, for their stubbornness, which was a challenge to the established order. These public executions were part of a cunning plan. The inquisitors perfectly understood that primal fear worked far better than any sermons. People saw the fire, smelled the burning flesh, and couldn't help but wonder, was it worth arguing with those who held the torch? But heresy, despite their efforts, did not disappear. It went underground, hiding in remote mountains and dense forests. The Cathars created an entire network of secret communities where their perfecti continued to teach people how to live without the church. The Waldensians also held on tight. Their words spread everywhere like the wind, and the church was slowly but surely losing its grip. The trials by hot iron and water could terrify the crowd, but they couldn't uproot the roots of heresy deeply embedded in minds. The church saw that it needed a new, more organized force to finally break the deviants. This was the first decisive step towards creating the very Inquisition we are talking about. After long, bloody wars with the heretics, the church concluded that bonfires alone were clearly not enough for complete control. In the 13th century, when the military campaigns against the Cathars concluded, the victors wanted to keep the survivors under constant, humiliating control. And that's when yellow crosses became part of their sinister plan. Their introduction was sealed by the decision of the Council of Toulouse, where the priests gathered to solidify their victory. All repentant heretics were henceforth forced to wear 2 large crosses sewn onto their clothing, one on the chest, the other on the back. The size of the crosses was intentionally large, so that no one, not a single soul in the crowd, could possibly miss them. The color was chosen specifically, bright yellow, because it didn't just catch the eye, but in those times it was associated with shame, ostracism, or dangerous disease. Like with lepers, people shunned those who walked under this humiliating mark, as if they were plague-stricken. And this completely cut off former Cathars from normal society. Life with this yellow cross turned into a daily, unbearable ordeal. A person could be kicked out of a shop, refused work, children in the street would throw stones, and neighbors would whisper maliciously behind their backs. The church strictly monitored that the crosses always remained in place. If anyone dared to tear them off or hide them under clothing, a new, harsher punishment awaited them, even up to a return to the fire. This gruesome brand kept former Cathars in constant, paralyzing fear. They became a living, walking lesson for anyone who even considered going against the one true faith. The idea proved so effective, so sinister that it was later adopted elsewhere spreading like a virus. Those yellow signs became chilling, harbinger of how power could humiliate and stigmatize people, turning them into living targets for the mob. The church got what it wanted. Heretics were either utterly broken under this oppression, or they were forced to vanish without a trace. But the Inquisition didn't spare the powerful either. The story of Raymond V, the mighty Count of Toulouse, vividly shows how even aristocrats were punished. He was accused of supporting heretics because it was on his vast lands in the fertile south of France that the Cathars flourished. As if completely untouched, the church simply couldn't stand that an influential count was protecting those who openly undermined its authority and influence. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III declared a full-blown crusade against the Cathars, and Raymond was immediately caught in its terrifying path. He was excommunicated, threatened with the loss of all his titles, and, worst of all his lands. The count ruled over the wealthy region of Toulouse, where heretics lived openly, not hiding. He of course didn't want war, but he also didn't want to hand his subjects over to be butchered. So the church decided to break his will in the most humiliating way possible, and show everyone, this is what happens to the patrons of apostates. Raymond, gritting his teeth, agreed to public penance just to somehow cling to his power and avoid utter ruin. On a sweltering early summer day in 1209, he came to the town of St. Giles. There, he was forced to strip off his luxurious shoes and expensive count's robes. Barefoot, in just a simple shirt, he walked through the town streets. Priests walking beside him lashed his back with thin whips, leaving bloody welts on his skin. The crowd, vast and gawking gathered all along the route, staring at this degrading spectacle and whispering. People watched as their once mighty count, who had ruled them for years, stumbled and fell under the blows. The priests walked alongside impassively, reading prayers and watching carefully to ensure the punishment was carried out to the bitter end. Raymond clenched his teeth against the pain and humiliation, but every lash of the whip reminded him of the terrible price he was paying. This wasn't just punishment, not just humiliation, it was a full-blown show for the crowd, a spectacle watched with wild curiosity and awestruck horror. The count's path wound through dust and mud, stones digging into his bare feet, the midday sun baking his head. People in the crowd alternated between silence and shouting, some pitying him, others gloating over the mighty man's fall. The church got what it wanted. Raymond survived, but his power was severely crippled. His lands became a coveted prize for numerous enemies who were just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In 1215, a year of crucial church decisions, a Dominican priest and preacher named Dominic Guzman, a Spaniard, founded the order that became the cornerstone of the very Inquisition we know today. This man, fanatically devoted to the church, burned with desire to fight heresy, not just with the sword but primarily with words and a sharp mind. He saw how the Cathars and Waldensians were leading vast masses of people away from the true church, and he decided to bring them back through persuasive sermons. His order, officially named the Order of Preachers, soon became widely known as the Dominican Order. Pope Gregory IX, recognizing their zeal and talents, entrusted them with the monumental task to hunt down and root out the apostates. And so, step by agonizing step the Inquisition in its classic form took shape. The Church didn't choose the Dominicans by accident. They possessed the deepest knowledge of theology and could confidently, argumentatively counter the heretics in debates, shattering their arguments. Their sharp minds and extensive preaching experience made them the perfect obedient hand of church authority. The Dominicans, natural organizers, brought order where chaos and disorganized persecutions once reigned. They developed rigid rules that became their unbreakable charter and built a veritable machine that, with methodical precision hunted down heretics one by one. This ruthless machine the Inquisition relied on the dirtiest, most cowardly tool: informers. Absolutely anyone could become an informer. A neighbor who noticed someone praying a little too quietly, or conversely, a little too loudly, could immediately whisper about it to the vigilant monks. A wife tired of her husband could denounce him if he was reading strange books. Even children not understanding the full horror, could point the finger at their own parents, condemning them to suffering. The Dominicans, like a giant spider gathered these rumors and gossip, weaving their deadly webs. They didn't just pounce and arrest everyone immediately. First they meticulously investigated dug deeper searching for any, even the slightest trace of apostasy. The denunciation was just the beginning, a thin thread leading to the suspect. The monks knew perfectly well that heresy, in their view, lurked deep within thoughts and they knew how to find it, using the envious or frightened eyes of others. Then came the interrogations. The suspect was summoned to a closed soundproof room. These weren't noisy town squares with crowds of onlookers, but quiet, grim halls where an oppressive gloom reigned. The Dominicans sat at a massive table, laying out quills, inkwells, and enormous ledger books. They asked questions. Did you believe in the Holy Trinity? Did you attend Mass regularly? Listening intently to the answers and meticulously recording every word, every sound. If the person stammered got nervous or, God forbid, remained silent, it was immediately recorded as a sign of guilt. The monks dug into the most intimate details of their lives, searching for any trifles, missed services, strange habits, long-forgotten rumors whispered behind their backs. They were convinced that lies would inevitably reveal themselves in words, and they would extract them with the persistence of a bulldog. Interrogations could last for hours, sometimes even days on end, without a break. The person was left alone against their sophisticated minds, and steel will until the truth the inquisitors wanted finally surfaced. An important nuance. Torture was used relatively rarely in those early days. The monks relied more on psychological pressure, cunning questions, and threats than on brute physical force. Although, of course, that kind of pressure alone could break anyone, trials concluded this agonizing process. The Dominicans gathered all the evidence that grew from denunciations and confessions beaten out during interrogations. They convened formal assemblies where sentence was passed. These weren't swift, spontaneous executions at the stake, but structured proceedings with meticulous record-keeping and adherence, albeit to their own rules. The monks read out the accusations, leafed through their bulky books discussing a person's fate as if haggling in a market. A person could be found guilty of heresy, of blasphemy, or even, for secret doubts held deep within their mind. Sentences varied. Some were released with a stern warning others sent into exile, stripped of all possessions. But if the guilt seemed particularly grievous to the inquisitors, the case went further, to the ultimate horror. The Dominicans, formally not dirtying their hands, handed the condemned over to the secular authorities who were responsible for lighting the fire. The monks themselves very rarely carried out the sentences, leaving the bloody work to others. This rigid code of action this ruthless machine rested on meticulously developed rules. Early statutes laid their foundation, and later figures like Bernard Guay made them even more specific and utterly merciless. Bernard Guay was the Inquisitor of Toulouse in the early 14th century, and wrote an entire book that became a veritable textbook for other monk inquisitors. He meticulously taught how to conduct interrogations, how to read denunciations, and most importantly how to pass a sentence that would satisfy the Church. But alas, the Inquisition wasn't always limited to just words and psychological pressure. By the mid-13th century, the Church faced a new, unpleasant challenge. Heretics, seeing the Inquisitors' methods, were becoming cleverer, more cunning. They learned to hide their true thoughts, and interrogations without force were losing their effectiveness. The shift to the active use of torture instruments happened when Pope Innocent IV in 1252 issued his sinister decree which essentially untied the inquisitors' hands. Before this, they more often just threatened torture than actually maimed people, but from that moment on, torture officially entered their arsenal. This, of course, didn't mean every interrogation necessarily ended in blood and screams. The Church, strange as it may seem, primarily wanted confessions, not mutilated corpses. The torture instruments themselves were created by craftsmen. the same blacksmiths and carpenters who worked for secular courts. They forged iron and shaped wood, turning them into terrifying mechanisms of pain. The inquisitors took these existing inventions, added their own ideas, and put them to use, perfecting the infernal instruments. This transition to torture was born, as they saw it, out of necessity. When words, threats, and psychological pressure stopped working, the Inquisition brought out its instruments. These horrific devices were designed to break not just the body, but above all, to shatter the human will. One of the most infamous and horrifying was the Spanish boot. This was an iron device made of several parts fitted onto the leg and tightly compressed from ankle to knee. The inquisitors or their assistants would slowly turn special screws, causing the leg bones to fracture with a terrifying crunch, and the flesh to tear. The person screamed in unbearable pain, begging for mercy. The monks calmly waited for them to talk, naively believing that suffering drove out the lies. Another nightmarish instrument was the wheel. The person was tightly bound to a large wooden circle, which was slowly or quickly spun by the executioner's hands. The ropes stretched the victim's body, joints were wrenched out with a horrible screech and muscles tore from the unimaginable tension. This stretching could last for hours until the victim finally gave up, ready to confess anything just to stop the torment. The rack or strappado was also actively used. The victim's hands were tightly bound to ropes passed over a pulley on the ceiling, and heavy weights were attached to their feet. The person's body simply hung in midair. A special mechanism pulled the ropes up and down, stretching the spine and tearing limbs from their joints. The pain became utterly unbearable, and the person inevitably broke under its monstrous assault. But it's important to note, these horrific instruments weren't always used. Far more often they were simply threatened. The inquisitors would show the Spanish boot or slowly turn the wheel right before the suspect's eyes. Just the sight of that cold iron, the creak of wood and the knowledge of what they did with them was more terrifying than the physical pain itself. People had heard horrifying tales of those whose legs were turned to bloody pulp or those stretched to their breaking point on the rack. This animal fear alone loosened tongues, and many confessed without a single screw turned or a single blow landed. The monks knew perfectly well, even the shadow of these grim machines made people talk faster than the strongest steel. They deliberately kept the torture instruments in plain sight, a constant, ominous reminder of what awaited the stubborn. Real pain came only when words extracted by fear lost their power. And words didn't lose it that often, because the fear of the iron itself beat out the truth they were desperate to hear. So what landed people in the jaws of this monstrous machine that ground down souls and bodies? Heresy topped the list. Rejection of any church dogma was considered the most grievous mortal sin. A person could simply doubt the Holy Trinity, the sacrament of communion, or, God forbid, the absolute authority of the Pope. Such seditious thoughts were caught during interrogations, and they were more than enough to send a person straight to the torture instruments. The inquisitors saw this as poison that was corrupting the one true faith. Blasphemy was also punished brutally. Any swearing in church, any ill-considered shout near the altar, or even laughter during Mass would immediately reach the inquisitors' ears through their ubiquitous informers. Even such a trifle could cost a person their life. Incorrect prayer also made the list. A person might whisper the words of prayer not quite as they were taught or skip certain parts. Neighbors, watching their every move noticed this, reported it. And the inquisitors would decide, aha, that smacks of heresy They looked for even the slightest hint of deviation, any tiniest crack in behavior, any oddity. The monks dug deep unbelievably deep. Heresy was considered not only loud open words but also meaningful silence. If someone was silent during interrogation, it was immediately interpreted as a confession of guilt. If they talked too much, the monks searched for lies in every single word. Blasphemy was found in accidental curses blurted out in anger in the wrong place. And incorrect prayer could simply be an old habit inherited from a grandmother that differed from the new. Strict canon. The inquisitors saw a threat in every step, every glance, every breath. They fervently, believed that an apostate infected others like plague and they would burn them out without the slightest pity. The list of accusations grew daily. A person could be seized for harmless argument with a neighbor or for mysterious whisper in a corner. Anything that even slightly deviated from the strict norms became grounds for arrest and trial. Their ruthless machine ground people down for their thoughts, for their words, and even for things they didn't do at all. But was there any chance of salvation if a person categorically denied everything, and crucially gave the inquisitors no real grounds for guilt? They were sometimes, very rarely, let go. It happened that even the most sophisticated inquisitors couldn't find enough evidence. Then they could issue a formal warning and leave them be, although, I repeat, such cases were incredibly rare, almost miraculous. But even in that case, the fear of false accusations, of a new indictment, still hung over everyone like a sword of Damocles. But here, a staggering, almost paradoxical fact emerges. The inquisitors, these machines for extracting confessions, meticulously recorded literally every cry of their victims. They kept vast, thick ledgers where they entered absolutely everything: groans under the Spanish boot, the horrifying crunch of bones on the rack, their last words before being sent to the fire. Their archives grew over the years, becoming far more voluminous and detailed than even the archives of kings. The monks recorded every interrogation, every trial, and it seems, every single drop of pain and suffering. This made their records incredibly precise and thorough, far more accurate than any secular chronicles. Kings might lose their papers in wars or fires, while the inquisitors guarded their volumes as if they were the greatest treasure. They recorded names, exact dates, details of accusations, and of course, the confessions. Every shriek of terror was committed to parchment, so that descendants, by their sinister design, would know how effectively their hand had worked. This was their strange, twisted pride. They saw in this the establishment of order, which, in their view, vanquished the chaos of heresy. Among the vivid yet tragic figures associated with the Inquisition stands out Pietro of Verona. This Dominican monk lived in the middle of the 13th century and became famous for his fanatical struggle against heretics in northern Italy. He was born in Verona, and ironically, into a family that was itself inclined towards Cathar heresy, but Pietro chose a different path, a path of service to the Church, and became one of its most zealous defenders. He was distinguished by a sharp mind, ruthlessness, and a will of steel. He was appointed inquisitor, and he set about uprooting apostates with frantic zeal. In the cities of Lombardy, he held courts, searching out heretics with the methodical precision of a hunter, and handed them over to the secular authorities for execution without hesitation. He was panickingly feared. People whispered that his gaze penetrated the very soul, and his words broke any, even the most stubborn resistance. The townsfolk, especially the artisans, who often rejected church rules, saw in him an enemy who knew neither pity nor mercy. In 1252, his path, full of righteous fury, was cut short. Pietro was walking from Como to Milan when he was attacked. The townsfolk, having accumulated fierce hatred towards him for his brutal courts, lay in wait for him on the road. One of them, a man named Carina, struck him with an axe straight to the head with a cry. The blow was so powerful it split his skull, and Pietro collapsed to the ground, leaving him no chance. The attackers finished him off with a dagger and seriously wounded his companion, another monk. The murderers managed to escape, but the news of the death of such a well-known inquisitor spread with incredible speed, and the Church, of course, did not stand idly by. Pietro was immediately proclaimed a martyr who had given his life for the faith. A year later, in 1253, Pope Innocent IV canonized him, adding him to the list of saints under the name Saint Peter Martyr. He began to be venerated as a great defender of the faith who fell in the struggle against heresy. Despite their attempts to hide, the murderers were found. Carina, the principal killer, later, rumor had it, repented and even became a monk, but his accomplices were caught, brought before the Inquisition's tribunal, and of course sentenced to brutal execution. Subsequently, they were executed, on the wheel. This was a horrifying spectacle for the enormous crowd gathered in the square. The Church demonstrated clearly that even the death of an inquisitor would not stop its punishing hand. Now let's transport ourselves to the Iberian Peninsula. to Spain, where the Inquisition took on a completely unique, distinct, and perhaps its most sinister form. Here, it didn't just combat heresies. It grew out of a fierce struggle for power and faith, becoming a most powerful instrument in the hands of the crown. It all began at the end of the 15th century, when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, these Catholic monarchs, united their lands into a single powerful kingdom. They dreamed of a strong, unified country where everyone spoke the same language, and most importantly, worshipped one God, professing a single faith. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV gave them the coveted permission to create their own royal inquisition. It differed drastically from the one operating in other European countries. The Spanish turned it into a sharp sword aimed primarily at those who hindered their grand design for national and religious unity. By 1492, after the final fall of Granada, the last stronghold of the Moors on the peninsula, and the horrific expulsion of the Jews from Spain, it unleashed its full force, becoming a symbol of absolute control and fear. The Spanish Inquisition eyed those who had converted to Christianity with special suspicious attention, especially if they still harbored the slightest doubt about their sincerity. These people were called conversos *. Among them were both Jews and Muslims who had crossed over to Christianity, most often under brutal pressure or out of fear, rarely of their own free will. Conversos were not some random target for the inquisitors. The Spanish Inquisition saw in them the main threat to the purity of the Catholic faith and the unity of the country. Jews who became Christians, pejoratively called *Moranos, might secretly, in the hidden corners of their homes, observe Shabbat or prepare food without forbidden pork. Muslims who became Christians, known as *Moriscos, sometimes out of habit, whispered prayers in Arabic or fasted during Ramadan. These tiniest habits were immediately noticed by vigilant neighbors, servants, and even their own children. Trained to inform, denunciations flew to the inquisitors like sparks from a furnace. The Church and the Crown believed that such people with double faith undermined the unity of the nation. They had been baptized, but their hearts, in the view of the monks, remained foreign, loyal to old customs. This was called the most terrible sin * double faith. The inquisitors firmly believed that this double faith infected society like a hidden deadly poison, and they set about eradicating it with ruthless cruelty, so that Spain finally would become a single, pure Christian kingdom, free from any impurities. Jewish conversos or Moranos were hit by this machine most often. Following the mass expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, many chose to stay, accepting baptism under duress. They were often engaged in trade, were skilled physicians, literate scribes. Their intelligence, entrepreneurship, and most importantly, their wealth aroused fierce envy among the old Christians. They whispered that Moranos secretly held their devilish rites, lit candles on Friday evenings, read forbidden books. Proof? They didn't always even look for it. Rumors, gossip, and the most groundless accusations were often more than enough to initiate an inquisitorial trial. Muslim conversos or Moriscos also suffered greatly from persecution. They lived in the villages and towns that had previously belonged to the Emirate of Granada. They were accused of performing ablutions before prayer out of old habit or preparing dishes according to ancient Muslim customs. The inquisitors saw in this clear, indelible traces of Islam, which in no way fit within the bounds of the new, true faith. Suspicions of double faith grew out of the most trivial details. A person might instinctively turn away from an icon, and that was already suspicious. Missed Mass due to illness, surely a heretic. A woman cooked meat without pork fat, as she was accustomed to. There was your evidence. A man wore clean clothes on a Saturday. Drag him to interrogation immediately. The inquisitors burrowed into everyone's life like worms in the earth. They listened to denunciations, conducted sudden searches of homes, sought out any, even the most microscopic, traces of apostasy. Neighbors became the most terrifying enemies. A single denunciation could completely shatter the life of an entire family, destroying it utterly. The Church demanded absolute purity of faith, and the conversos paid a terrible price for this. The baptism they had received did not save them. On the contrary, it placed them under the Inquisition's eternal, relentless crosshairs. The Spanish Inquisition had its unique peculiarity, which distinguished it from others. It served not only the powerful Church, but also The crown, Ferdinand and Isabella, saw in it a most powerful tool for uniting the people around their authority. Moreover, conversos often held very high and lucrative positions. They were royal advisors, tax collectors, wealthy merchants. Their immense wealth, of course, was a lure. The inquisitors, accusing them of heresy, confiscated their lands, homes, and money, thus replenishing the royal treasury. This made the hunt for double faith not only righteous but also incredibly profitable business. But purity of faith was not their only goal. Heresy as such was also sought out, though less frequently than hidden Jews and Muslims. The Spanish Inquisition kept a sharp eye on those who openly rejected church dogmas or dared to preach something different. Protestants, whose ideas began to seep into Spain through merchants and forbidden books, also fell under its ruthless gaze, and they were burned out with the same fanaticism. Alchemists or scientists whose research cast doubt on the Church's truths about the universe could also easily fall into the Inquisition's nets. However, I repeat, conversos remained the main, most sought-after prey. They were suspected far more often than anyone else, simply because of their background. Jews and Muslims who had converted became a sort of scapegoat for the whole of Spanish society. Their faith was constantly tested by the fire of inquisitorial pyres, and their fates were ruthlessly shattered for the sake of Spain's mythical unity. Church and kings, hand in hand, built a state where there was no room for any doubt, for any shades of faith. The Spanish Inquisition didn't lag behind in inventing instruments that made its executions truly horrifying spectacles. One of the main, most tidy instruments was the garrote. This was a special strangling device used for relatively quick executions. The condemned person was seated on a wooden chair. A rope was coiled around their neck, or an iron collar with a screw at the back was fitted. The executioner slowly or quickly turned this screw, tightening the noose. The neck snapped with a sharp, terrifying sound, and death occurred almost instantly. The garrote was valued for its tidiness. It finished the job without prolonged torment, which allowed the inquisitors to maintain a semblance of mercy, especially towards those who had repented before execution. It began to be used from 1480, when the Inquisition was just gaining its terrible power. This instrument became a sign of their absolute power, capable of extinguishing life without unnecessary noise or spilling blood on the scaffold, which distinguished it from hanging or beheading. Another instrument, shrouded in dark legends, was called the Iron Maiden. Though historians still debate the actual frequency of its use by the Spanish Inquisition. This was a tall, vertical cabinet, the inner surface of which was studded with sharp spikes. A person was led inside. The heavy door was closed, and the spikes slowly pierced their body under pressure. Historians do indeed debate how often this was actually applied. The archives of the Spanish Inquisition, surprisingly, do not mention the Iron Maiden directly. Most likely, it stood in the tribunal's cellars as a symbol of terror, as the last most terrifying threat. It was shown to suspects to extract a confession by sight alone, without actual physical action. Tales of the spiked cabinet circulated among Spaniards passed from mouth to mouth, increasing the panic fear of the inquisitorial trial. Even if it was rarely used in reality, its image became firmly embedded in the people's memory as a symbol of ultimate torture. The inquisitors, being excellent psychologists, skillfully used these rumors as a weapon, striking the victim without a single touch. By the 16th century, the Iron Maiden had definitively become part of a dark legend, although, I repeat, precise documentary traces of its widespread use are few. But the true apotheosis, the grand public spectacle that elevated executions to a completely new, horrifying level, were the auto da fé. The name translates from Portuguese as act of faith, and these ceremonies gathered thousands, tens of thousands of eyes, eager for a spectacle. They began to be held in Spain from 1481, first in Seville, a city that became one of the centers of the Spanish Inquisition. The condemned, sentenced to various punishments, were led out into the city's main square on the appointed day. They were dressed in special long shirts called Sanbenitos emblazoned with red crosses and images of flames. This clearly displayed their guilt to the whole world. The inquisitors solemnly, loudly read out the sentences, priests offered prayers, and the enormous crowd buzzed with wild curiosity and fear. Then, at the climax of this terrible act, the fires were lit. Heretics sentenced to death were tied to tall stakes, wood was set alight at their feet, and the flames, like a living monster, engulfed their bodies. Smoke rose to the sky, and the cries of the unfortunate victims echoed across the square, drowning out everything around. Auto-da-fés lasted for hours, sometimes from morning until deep into the night. They began with long sermons, proceeded to the executions, and concluded with solemn hymns. This was a true spectacle designed to instill absolute, unquestioning obedience in the populace. Spaniards, raised in a spirit of fanatical faith, often saw in this not cruelty, but the victory of faith over the apostates. The inquisitors planned every step of this horrifying show with diabolical precision. They chose the largest cities, like Toledo or Valladolid, where enormous crowds gathered. An execution at a single such auto-da-fé could claim dozens of human lives in a day. For example, in 1485 in Zaragoza, a single auto-da-fé saw 20 people burned. People came from mourning, brought food and drinks, and watched until night as if at some kind of performance. This monstrously strengthened the power of the church and the crown. People left the square with a firm thought: heresy cannot survive under their vigilant gaze, under their fire. Thus, the garrote and auto-da-fé served different but complementary purposes. The garrote executed quietly, almost unnoticed, while the auto-da-fés thundered across Spain, sowing fear everywhere. And the Iron Maiden, though debatable in its actual use, added that very shadow of terror that hovered over everyone who deviated even slightly from the norm. Behind these executions, behind all this horror, lay yet another sinister defining idea: purity of blood. The Spanish called it limpieza de sangre. This was not just a check of ancestry. It was a system that literally decided a person's entire future fate. Without pure blood, one could not become an official. One could not serve in the church. One could not even take a wife from old, respected Christian families. It all began even before the official formation of the Spanish Inquisition in 1449 in the city of Toledo. Then local authorities, fearing the influence of conversos, barred them from holding any official positions. By 1547, this rule, this horrific brand, had become law throughout Spain. A person hoping to achieve anything at all in life had to provide official documents proving the complete absence of Jewish or Muslim ancestors tracing back through how many generations. The inquisitors, tasked with this filthy work, literally dug through people's pasts, interrogated witnesses, and searched for any flaws in the family tree. If they found even the slightest trace of Moranos or Moriscos, the path to a career, to respect, to a normal life was immediately slammed shut. Even the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who had once accepted baptism lived under this eternal, humiliating burden of suspicion. Purity of blood became a true passport to life, a kind of ticket to high society. It was rigorously checked upon entry into prestigious orders, even those like the Dominicans, who, having arrived from France, served successfully in Spain as well. It was required for positions in courts, in the treasury, in any even slightly significant structures of power. Families guarded documents about their pure ancestors as if they were the greatest treasures, because one wrong step, one envious denunciation could shatter everything built over generations. In 1556 in Seville, a man was put on trial specifically for forging purity of blood documents. He was immediately stripped of his treasury position, and his entire family was branded with shame. This purity of blood rule effectively divided Spanish society into two unequal parts. Old Christians proudly boasted of their lineage and pure blood, while conversos, if they could, tried to hide their roots, live unnoticed, fearing every whisper. The Inquisition, of course, kept a sharp eye on every single one of them. Methodically, brick by brick, it built a Spain where blood mattered far more than faith itself. The Spanish Inquisition left a truly deep, bloody scar on the fates of thousands upon thousands of people. Its victims very often became not just the persecuted, but true pawns in a big, cruel game of power, politics, and fanatical faith. One such unfortunate was Antonio del Campo, a merchant from Toledo, whose life ended in the most tragic way in 1561. He came from a converso family, whose ancestors, Jewish by blood, had accepted baptism many years earlier in 1492. To avoid expulsion and remain in Spain, Antonio led a humble, seemingly unremarkable life, selling fabrics and spices in the city market. But his background, his impure blood, made him an easy target for the vigilant eyes of the Inquisition. It was in 1561 that Antonio's neighbors began suspiciously whispering about his strange habits. They noticed he never bought pork from the butchers, and that on Saturdays, the day of the Jewish Sabbath, he always appeared in a fresh, clean shirt, which was also considered extremely suspicious for a true Christian. These tiny, insignificant details reached the inquisitors via a vigilant informant. One neighbor whose shop was next to Antonio's declared to the inquisitors that Antonio shunned Christian food and lived not according to the customs of true Christians. The inquisitors immediately began an investigation. They burst into Antonio's house, turned everything upside down, searched chests, examined the kitchen, and what did they find? An oil lamp which, in their opinion, had burned on Friday evening, and a piece of cloth which they decided he might have used for Sabbath rituals. Antonio, terrified, insisted that he was a good, faithful Christian, regularly attended Mass and honored the Church. But his words, full of despair, were simply drowned in the flood of accusations. He was taken to the grim dungeon of the Toledo tribunal. There he was kept in damp and cold, interrogated day after day, without rest, without mercy. The inquisitors demanded confession to secret, diabolical Jewish rites, but he stood firm, denying everything. Then they resorted to a more effective, as they saw it, method: physical pressure. He was subjected to torture on the rack, and Antonio broke, unable to bear the hellish pain. He cried out something that the inquisitors immediately interpreted as a confession. The trial convened incredibly quickly. He was accused of heresy for allegedly praying in Hebrew and rejecting Christ. The sentence was predictably harsh. In that same year, 1561, he was tied to a stake in the central square of Toledo. The wood ignited, and the fire claimed his life before the eyes of a huge crowd, who watched in stunned silence and fear. His house, his shop, everything was confiscated for the crown and the church, leaving his family destitute. The archives of Toledo, these grim witnesses of the era, preserved this case, showing how a single denunciation and suspicious origin could mercilessly ruin a man. Antonio's terrible fate did not spare his relative either. Elvira del Campa, Sturesca merchant's wife, mother of 4 children, living in the same Toledo, suffered a similar fate in the same fateful year of 1561. Her name surfaced after Antonio's execution, when the inquisitors, like butchers, decided to cleanse the entire family, everyone who might be linked to impure blood. Elvira's neighbor, that same vigilant informant who had long eyed her seemingly not inconsiderable wealth, denounced her to the tribunal, stating that Elvira cooked meat without pork and sang strange melodies resembling Jewish ones. He even claimed he heard her suspicious whispering at night when she stood by the hearth. The inquisitors did not delay. They appeared at her home. During the search, they found an old Hebrew book hidden in a chest which had belonged to her grandfather. Elvira swore in terror that she didn't even know the book existed, that she was a Christian to the bone. But her voice trembled with fear, and the Inquisition court already saw an undoubted culprit in her. She was taken to the very same dungeon where Antonio had recently been held. Interrogations began with persuasion, then quickly escalated to overt threats. She held firm, denying all accusations, until the instruments of torture were brought in. She was tied to a table. Her arms and legs were stretched with ropes that dug into her flesh, causing unbearable pain. The inquisitors demanded the names of other heretics, but Elvira remained silent, clenching her teeth. Then they increased the pressure, tightening screws, pulling the ropes taut. Her body contorted from the tension into an unnatural position, until she, unable to bear the hellish torment, cried out some confession to something she had not committed. The court convened that same month. The decision was predetermined. She was accused of secretly following Jewish rites, singing forbidden songs, and denying the Christian faith. The sentence was inevitable. At that very same horrific auto da fe in 1561, where Antonio had likely also burned, she was led out into the square wearing a sanbenito with a red cross on her chest. The fire, like an insatiable monster, consumed her, and her cries of pain and terror were drowned out by the triumphant hymns of the priests. The crowd watched as yet another life dissolved into the acrid smoke of the Inquisition's pyre. Her case, like Antonio's, was recorded in those same grim archives of Toledo, as yet another example of a family chain of suspicion that the Inquisition ruthlessly severed with fire. These two tragic fates, Antonio and Elvira del Campo, like a drop of water, reflect the entire essence of the Spanish Inquisition. They became prey not because of their actions, but because of their origin, because of impure blood. They were accused based on empty gossip, neighborly envy, and primitive superstitions. The courts latched onto trivialities, everyday minutiae, just to justify a predetermined death sentence, while the truth was lost in the dark shadows of prison cells and the smoke of pyres. Fire and denunciations, these two terrible pillars, fueled the pervasive fear that reigned in Spain, and their names, the names of Antonio and Elvira, remained in the inquisitional documents as a grim eternal warning to everyone else. The Inquisition, this guardian of religious orthodoxy, repeatedly engaged in a brutal, irreconcilable struggle with those bold minds who dared to push the boundaries of human knowledge. Its shadow fell upon those who gazed at the sky through a telescope or delved into the secrets of nature, thus challenging the unshakable church dogmas. Over long centuries, during the transition from the Dark Middle Ages to the era of great scientific discoveries, disputes multiplied where science and faith crossed swords in a deadly battle. One of the most notorious, most famous echoes of this struggle was, of course, the trial of the great Galileo Galilei. But he, contrary to popular belief, was far from the first whose ideas so greatly alarmed the vigilant church. The Spanish and Roman Inquisitions, united in their fear, kept a close watch on those engaged in astronomy or alchemy, seeing in these pursuits a direct threat to the order that had been built for centuries on the basis of church teachings. These stories eloquently show how the Inquisition punished not so much for the knowledge or discoveries themselves, but for the courage to openly express them, for the audacity to go against the official line. The classic conflict with Galileo erupted in Rome in 1633, reaching its peak. Galileo was a brilliant Italian scientist, famous for his ingenious observations of stars and planets using a telescope he had personally improved. Based on the work of the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus, he boldly proved that the Earth revolves around the Sun, and not the other way around. Speaking of Copernicus, the Polish astronomer died in 1543. His main work, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, was published in the year of his death, and this is precisely why he escaped the Inquisition's trial. His book appeared when the author himself was no longer alive. During his lifetime, Copernicus, being a cautious man, kept his revolutionary ideas to himself, not risking openly preaching them. The Church at the time did not actively persecute the book itself, but later, in 1616, it still ended up on the list of forbidden books. Galileo, however, inspired by Copernicus's ideas, went further and dared to publicly advocate for them. His main trouble began not because of his scientific discoveries as such, but because of his audacity and insubordination. Back in 1616, the all-powerful Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, one of the most influential men in the Church, explicitly forbade him from publicly defending the heliocentric system. The Church officially declared these ideas dangerous to the literal interpretation of Holy Scripture. Galileo then formally agreed to remain silent, but being a passionate advocate for truth, he couldn't help himself. In 1632, he published his famous book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In it, using the form of a dialogue, he compared the outdated Ptolemaic system with the new Copernican system, clearly presenting the latter in a much more favorable light. This sent the inquisitors into a rage. They saw in this a direct, blatant challenge to their power, their authority. Galileo's trial began in the spring of 1633. He, already an old and ill man, nearly 70-year-old, with legs trembling from age, was summoned to Rome. The Inquisition, taking into account his fame and age, did not break his body on the rack. They chose a different instrument, house arrest. He was accused of violating the 1616 ban and of undermining the teachings of the Church with his book. Galileo tried to explain that his book merely discussed different scientific theories, not imposed a single one. But the judges of the Inquisition, alas, remained deaf to his arguments. They forced him, kneeling, to publicly recant heliocentrism and read a statement that the Earth was immobile at the center of the universe. The sentence, by Inquisition standards, turned out to be relatively lenient. He was sent under house arrest to his own home in Florence, where he lived until his death in 1642. The book, of course, was immediately banned, but the ideas, despite all efforts, survived and continued to spread. This case clearly showed that the Inquisition punished primarily for disobedience, for the audacity to go against its will, rather than for scientific discoveries about stars and planets. What else, beside heliocentrism, could land one under the vigilant, punishing gaze of the Inquisition? Cosmology. Any contemplation of the universe caused serious concern for the Church. The ideas of Giordano Bruno about the infinity of the universe became one of the most striking and tragic examples of such persecution. Bruno, a former monk and philosopher living at the end of the 16th century, claimed that the stars we see in the sky are distant suns just like ours, and that the universe stretches without end, infinite. His thoughts went much further than the ideas of Copernicus and even Galileo, essentially denying the existence of any center of the world. The Inquisition, deeming his ideas extremely dangerous, seized him in 1593 in Venice, and his trial dragged on for a long, agonizing 7 years. He was held in solitary confinement, demanding and insisting that he renounce his seditious views. Bruno firmly insisted that the infinity of the universe in no way contradicted the idea of God. On the contrary, it merely confirmed his greatness. But the Church saw in this a terrible danger, an undermining of its foundations. In 1600, unbroken, he was burned at the stake in the Campo de' Fiori Square in Rome. The flames became a cruel, final answer to his revolutionary cosmology. The inquisitors were certain that such views undermined the authority of Holy Scripture and destroyed the divinely established order. Alchemy also often fell into the Inquisition's nets. Its mysterious connection with magic and esotericism greatly alarmed the Church. Alchemists, these medieval chemists, sought ways to turn base metals into gold or even discover the secret of immortality, the elixir of eternal life. Their furnaces smoked with strange vapors, and their books were filled with incomprehensible symbols and drawings. The Inquisition, seeing in all this traces of witchcraft and collusion with the devil, actively persecuted them. In Spain, such cases surfaced less often than in other countries, but they did occur. In 1529 in Toledo, a man was put on trial specifically for practicing alchemy. He mixed strange powders while reading old, dusty manuscripts. Neighbors, of course, informed that he was brewing potions and whispering spells. The inquisitors, arriving to search his home, found drawings with magical circles and notes in Latin. All of this was declared evidence. He was interrogated and accused of magic and sorcery. Fortunately for him, the court decided on a relatively lenient punishment. He was simply expelled from the city, and he avoided the stake. The Inquisition, it seems, simply didn't fully understand what alchemy was, confusing scientific pursuits with sin and seeing a threat where there was none at all. Incredibly, the Inquisition at times surprised with its attitude towards science. Some of its servants were themselves educated people, and even looked at the sky, studying the stars. One such astonishing example was the Jesuit Christopher Clavius who lived at the end of the 16th century. He was born in 1538 in Bamberg, Germany, and showed an incredible talent for mathematics from his youth. In 1556, he joined the Jesuit order, which, unlike many others, successfully combined deep faith with a thirst for new knowledge and education. Clavius moved to Rome, where he began teaching mathematics at the Roman College, the main Jesuit school, training future priests and scholars. He penned scientific works on geometry and astronomy, shaping young minds. His writings were read throughout Europe, and he became a kind of bridge between the old scientific world and new discoveries. In 1579, none other than Pope Gregory XIII himself summoned Clavius for a vital, state-level task. The Julian calendar, which Europe had been using since the time of Julius Caesar, had gone awry, and was already trailing by a full 10 days. This caused problems calculating the date of Easter, which drifted further and further from the vernal equinox, and the Church was literally losing its familiar rhythm. Clavius took on the challenge. He amassed a huge body of data on the movements of the sun and moon, painstakingly calculating their paths with pen and ruler. His work spanned many long years, and finally, in 1582, the new improved Gregorian calendar saw the light of day. The Pope solemnly declared that after October 4th, 1582, would immediately come October 15th, thus erasing the accumulated 10 days and restoring astronomical accuracy to the calendar. Clavius didn't just count stars. He also actively debated other scholars who doubted his calculations, and crucially defended his scientific findings before the church authorities. His calendar became the foundation of the very calendar we use worldwide even today. The Jesuits saw in him the pride of their order, and the Inquisition remained silent, because his scientific work served their chief celebration, Easter. This case vividly demonstrated that science could find its place even within the walls of the Inquisition, provided it didn't directly challenge the fundamentals of faith. Another, no less intriguing story is connected with Francesco Ingoli, also an inquisitor, who, however, debated Galileo on a scientific level. This began in Rome in the early 17th century when Galileo was actively advocating for the idea of the earth revolving around the sun. Ingoli, being a scholar and a priest, was born in Ravenna in 1578. He studied law and astronomy, and later became one of the Inquisition's advisors. In 1616, he wrote a letter to Galileo that kicked off their battle of wits. Ingoli objected to heliocentrism, but not with threats and torches, but with logic and scientific arguments. He claimed that stars, according to the heliocentric model, should change their apparent position in the sky, depending on the Earth's movement. But this wasn't observed, and Ingoli believed that Galileo hadn't convincingly proven the existence of this effect. He delved deep into mathematics, pointed out weaknesses in Galileo's calculations, and proposed his own findings. Galileo responded with treatises, defending his numbers, and their debate dragged on for many long years. But Ingoli, despite his affiliation with the Inquisition, was no blind fanatic. He read Copernicus, knew the works of the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe, and debated the physics of stellar motion. His letter to Galileo in 1616 clearly went beyond a simple religious dispute. He wrote about the laws of motion, about how, in his opinion, the sun and earth should behave in the sky. When Galileo was tried in 1633, Ingoli was no longer at the tribunal. He had died earlier, in 1649, but his scientific arguments, written many years before, still echoed in court. The inquisitors seized upon his words to ramp up the pressure on Galileo, accusing him of violating the ban. This dispute showed that the Inquisition, despite its anti-science leanings, could step into the game of science if it saw a chance to bolster its own case and discredit undesirable ideas. Ingoli left his mark on the history of astronomy, even as he served as its judge. Unhappy women also often found themselves in the grim shadow of the Inquisition's suspicions, and their lives became the thinnest, most fragile threads in the complex, merciless web of its trials. The Inquisition saw in them a source of turmoil, an unpredictable force, which they believed could shatter the established order of faith and society. What's striking, the accusations against them stretched far beyond the classical accusations of witchcraft, which later became such a notorious, albeit distorted, myth. They were tried for acts that today would seem utterly innocent, but in the eyes of the Church held a hidden, diabolical threat. For example, herbal healing fell under this scrutiny. Women who, since ancient times, were knowledgeable about plants, gathered them, dried them over fire, and prepared brews for the sick, were considered potentially dangerous. They helped people with fevers, colds, and other seemingly minor illnesses, but the Inquisitors found clear traces of heresy, or worse, witchcraft, in this folk healing. In 1526, a chilling case is recorded in the archives of the Toledo Tribunal. A woman from Navarre treated people with simple herbs, chamomile and mint, mixing them in a cauldron. Neighbors, ever vigilant and envious, noticed the strange smell of her infusions, and oh the horror, the patients recovered too quickly. They immediately reported that she was muttering strange words over her brews. The Inquisitors, arriving to search her home, found a notebook with recipes, and, of course, immediately deemed it proof of witchcraft. She was interrogated, subjected to pressure, until she broke and confessed. She was burned in the square before everyone's eyes. Various fabricated accusations of the evil eye and hexes also often led women straight to the tribunal. A woman could be accused if her gaze was linked to some misfortune. In 1612 in Zaragoza, a poor old woman was tried for this. Her neighbor, clearly unhappy about something, swore to the inquisitors that she had looked at her chickens, and they died the next morning. The inquisitors, of course, immediately searched the old woman's home and began searching for marks of the devil on her body. They found a scar, which, without a shadow of a doubt, they declared a devil's mark. She desperately denied her guilt, but the court naturally decided otherwise. She was burned before a crowd that whispered fearfully about her curses, even overly loud. Improper laughter became grounds for accusations. In 1585 in Seville, a woman was condemned for laughing too loudly in the market. Some merchant complained that after her laughter, his fish went bad, and neighbors, adding fuel to the fire, added that she laughed in a somehow unchristian way. The inquisitors, of course, saw in this demonic mockery. She was tried and simply banished from the city, thereby robbing her family of its sole breadwinner. But women didn't only suffer for their actions, real or imagined. Their very social position in society often made them easy prey for the Inquisition. In 16th century Spain, for example, widows and single elderly women particularly often ended up on trial. They lived apart from family, which immediately gave rise to a host of sinister rumors and gossip. In 1551 in Barcelona, a woman was tried merely for her cat, which had a habit of walking on roofs. Neighbors, deciding this was her spirit, reported her to the tribunal. The inquisitors, searching her home, found needles and deemed them instruments of witchcraft. She was interrogated and ultimately banished from the city. This case vividly shows how simple loneliness became sufficient grounds for the most terrifying suspicions. And in 1578 in Madrid, a poor woman was stretched on the rack, trying to force a confession of dealings with demons. Her body was contorted into a horrific posture, until, unable to bear the pain, she confessed to what they wanted to hear. This showed that punishment methods were common for both men and women, but women were most often tried precisely because of their special role in the family, in the village, because of their vulnerable position. Various theories and treatises also added fuel to the fire of these horrific persecutions. One such theory claimed that an overly beautiful woman, could a priori be dangerous. The infamous treatise Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, directly asserted that the devil specifically tempted men through female appearance. They wrote that beauty was a trap set by Satan, leading men astray from God. The inquisitors eagerly seized upon these words. In 1621 in Córdoba, a woman was tried for her face. She stood out for her beautiful eyes and hair, which unsettled and troubled her neighbors. A vigilant priest reported to the tribunal that her appearance was the work of Satan. They interrogated her, searched for marks of the devil, and of course found a mole on her back, which they solemnly declared a devil's mark. The court predictably decided to burn her. Flames rose above the square while the crowd watching whispered fearfully about her charms. Another, no less dangerous theory claimed that being too intelligent was also a form of heresy. Women who preferred reading books to praying caused the church serious alarm. In 1548 in Valencia, a widow from a converso family was tried. She, an educated woman, kept the works of the famous humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam in her home, and, oh the horror, dared to debate matters of faith with guests. The neighbor, without hesitation, reported her that she reasoned about Scripture instead of praying as she should. The inquisitors, searching her home, found her writings where she set down her own thoughts. She was accused of heresy, claiming she placed her own reason above the church. The trial lasted several months. Ultimately, she was banished from the city, and her books were burned right in front of her home. For torturing women the Inquisition across Europe employed truly barbaric instruments. One such was the witch's chair. This was an iron throne, its seat and back studded with sharp spikes that dug into the victim's flesh. The woman was seated upon it and tightly bound with straps so she couldn't move. The spikes slowly, excruciatingly pierced the skin, and every breath or movement intensified the pain. Sometimes the chair was placed directly over a fire, heating the metal red hot until the heat burned the last strength from the victim. In 1611 in Germany, a woman was tied to such a chair for witchcraft. Her name was Maria, and she merely sold bread. Neighbors reported seeing her with herbs, and after that, the cows stopped giving milk. She screamed in pain until her voice gave out, while the executioners, unmoved, waited for a confession. In Bamberg, where witch trials were raging at the time, this chair became a terrifying symbol of horror. Another widespread and deadly method was drowning. The woman was thrown into a river or pond after having her hands and feet tightly bound with ropes. According to a wild superstition, it was believed that the pure element of water rejected a witch, because water is a pure element of God and does not accept the unclean associated with the devil. If the woman, defying logic, floated, this was considered an undeniable sign of guilt, since the water had rejected her, and if she drowned, she was formally declared clean. But what good was that if the person was already dead? In 1588 in France, in Lorraine, a woman was accused of spoiling the harvest. Her name was Jean, and she lived alone, earning a living by weaving baskets. Neighbors whispered that her evil gaze dried up the fields. She was thrown into the river with a stone tied around her neck. The water closed over her, and she of course drowned. The court later formally declared her innocent, but it was already too late. People watched from the bank whispering about curses, and the river carried the truth away with her life. This barbaric method was widely used throughout Europe, from England to Germany, where witch trials were gaining terrifying momentum. In 1591 in Scotland, a woman named Agnes Sampson was tested in the same manner. She was accused of raising storms that sank ships. She floated, and that became her death sentence. She was immediately pulled from the water and burned at the stake. These tests, in essence, turned a person's life into a deadly game with a guaranteed loss. In 1609 in England, a woman named Anne Whittle, known as Old Chattox, was tried. She was a poor old woman with a face etched with deep wrinkles and eyes that terrified the entire village. Anne lived in a dilapidated hut, weaving baskets and drying herbs for neighbors, trying to survive. But her trouble began with the most dreadful human vice, envy. One woman whose son was ill reported seeing Anne by the river at night, where she was singing under the moon. Another neighbor added that after her songs, her milk turned sour and the chickens stopped laying. Rumors grew like poisonous weeds. Soon, the entire village was already buzzing about her beauty and youth, with which she allegedly tempted men. In 1610 she was seized. The inquisitors searched her hut, found dried herbs and a rag doll, which they immediately declared diabolical. She was dragged for interrogation, stretched with ropes until her arms were wrenched from their sockets by unbearable pain. Unable to withstand these hellish torments, she of course gave a confession. The trial, formal and swift, took place in a single day. In 1612 she was hanged on a hill along with other witches. The crowd watched as the rope ended her life, and a neighbor's envy became her terrible end. And now we approach the twilight of the Inquisition when its grim, bloody curtain began a slow descent under the pressure of daring minds, and a new era, the 18th century, became its final act in this centuries-long drama, as the light of the Enlightenment began to illuminate Europe, and the pyres that had blazed for centuries in the squares gradually died out in the shadow of triumphant reason. This wasn't just a decline, it was a true struggle of those who challenged its boundless power, from philosophers with their sharp pens to rulers with firm, reformist will. The Inquisition, which had held the continent in paralyzing fear for centuries, retreated, leaving behind only the chilling echo of former tribunals. The 18th century arrived with a wind of radical change, and the Inquisition, that giant with feet of clay, began to rapidly lose its grip. In Spain, King Charles III, ruling from the middle of the century, was inspired by the liberal ideas coming from revolutionary France. He read Voltaire, dreamed of progress, and viewed the Inquisition's tribunals as an old, burdensome impediment. He ordered their power weakened, public executions all but vanished, and interrogations, stripped of torture, became little more than empty formalities. In Portugal, the Marquis of Pombal, the powerful first minister and right hand of King José I, went even further. He didn't just limit the Inquisition's power. He completely tamed it, subordinating it to the crown, making its every move dependent on his personal word. These rulers didn't shatter it in one blow, oh no, they gradually, methodically extinguished its baleful flame, leaving the fearsome tools to gather dust in forgotten damp cellars. But the real storm, the one that ripped the roofs off the inquisitional tribunals, was stirred up by those who wrote and spoke, whose ideas pierced the darkness. The great Voltaire, the French philosopher with a sharp, scathing wit, became its most bitter, implacable foe. In his famous book, Candide, or Optimism, he brilliantly satirized the absurdity and cruelty of the inquisitional courts, exposing their ludicrousness through the story of the gruesome Lisbon auto-da-fe after the earthquake. His voice sounded louder than any in the case of Jean Calas, a Protestant unjustly executed in Toulouse on the preposterous charge of murdering his own son, who he supposedly wanted to convert to Catholicism. Voltaire, conducting his own investigation, proved his innocence, and Calas was posthumously acquitted. This became a true victory of reason over blind, fanatical faith. Voltaire wrote letters, published articles, argued, and openly called the Inquisition a madness that had drowned Europe in blood for centuries. His words spread across the continent like thunderclaps, sowing doubt in the minds of millions. Montesquieu, another great voice of the Enlightenment in his fundamental work, The Spirit of the Laws, directly demanded the creation of courts where logic and law reigned, not superstition and fear. He fiercely criticized power that held sway through the brute fear of the populace, and his book became a beacon for all who yearned for change. Diderot, creator of the famous encyclopedia, struck even deeper. He gathered, systematized, and spread knowledge that in itself swept away the old fears and prejudices, the very bedrock on which the Inquisition had stood for centuries. These three, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot, were like torches lighting the way towards the end of the Inquisitional era. Their ideas were picked up by university students, enlightened rulers, and even some priests, who began to doubt the former righteousness of the church courts. In Spain, Pablo de Olivet became a living, vivid example of resistance to this machine. This reformer dreamed of progress, read the forbidden books of the Enlightenment thinkers, and openly spoke of freedom of thought. In 1776, the Inquisition seized him for these views, imprisoning him in a monastery. But he didn't break. 4 years later, he managed to escape to France, where until his death at the beginning of the 19th century he wrote and argued, remaining a symbol of those who broke its chains. Meanwhile, in Portugal, as mentioned, Pombal didn't just limit the Inquisition, he essentially pulled its teeth. He forbade it from acting without his personal consent, transforming it from a fearsome tribunal into merely a pale shadow under the crown. And in Italy, Pope Benedict XIV, who reigned from 1740, also went against the old brutal customs. He softened the methods of the Roman Inquisition, removed the cruelest interrogations, making the courts less bloody. These steps, both within the Church itself and beyond it, undertaken by secular rulers, gradually extinguished the Inquisition's power, leaving only the chilling echoes of past horror. And of course, we can't fail to mention the man who delivered the final blow, finishing off the Inquisition once and for all. This was Napoleon Bonaparte. He stormed into Spain with his army carrying the ideas of the French Revolution, and in 1808 he simply shut down the last inquisitional tribunals in the country. He looked upon the Inquisition as old junk, hindering the construction of his new, enlightened Europe. His decrees scattered its judges, and all their millennia-old papers were filed away. In Italy, he also left his mark, subordinating the Church to his will and stripping it of its former worldly power. The French Revolution before him, with its cry of liberty, equality, fraternity, had already prepared the ground, burning away the very fear that had fed the inquisitorial fire for centuries. In Germany, the Prussian king Frederick the Great, who reigned in the 18th century, openly scorned superstition and built a world where reason reigned supreme over belief in demons. His lands became a sanctuary for those who fled the old inquisitional courts. And in Austria, Emperor Joseph II, outright banned witch trials, calling them a disgrace to the age of light. These rulers, each in their own way, were driving the Inquisition into the past. The Enlightenment itself, with its emphasis on reason, science, and tolerance, finally undermined belief in witchcraft and magic, which had once been the main fuel for the inquisitorial coals. By the end of the 18th century, tales of witches and devilish pacts became mere old tales, told by the fireside to frighten children, but no one truly believed in them anymore. Let's now delve into the final flickering notes of the Inquisition in various parts of the world, in Mexico, Spain, and Portugal, where, even in its twilight, it left bleak traces of struggle and stubbornness. In Mexico, then part of the vast Spanish colonies, the Inquisition, even in the 1790s, was still trying to keep people in line, but its voice no longer sounded as menacing and fanatical as before. Here, it judged not for the old grim tales of demons and witches, but for reading Voltaire. This French rebel, whose books branded the Inquisition as a relic of darkness, became a threat not so much to faith, but to politics and the established order. Let's consider one of the numerous telling examples. In 1792, in Mexico City, the Inquisition seized a young scribe named José Mario Morelos. He was a priest, but secretly read Voltaire's philosophical dictionary, and boldly debated ideas of freedom and reason with friends. Vigilant neighbors reported that he was praising ideas that undermined the crown and the church. The inquisitors searched his home and found that very dangerous book with underlined lines about reason and tolerance. He was convicted not of heresy in the old religious sense, but essentially of politics that openly reeked of the coming revolution. He received a severe reprimand, was forced to formally repent, and of course forbidden to read any dangerous texts. But Morelos didn't break. Later he became one of the greatest leaders of the Mexican War of Independence, which began in 1810. This process vividly showed how the Inquisition was clinging to the remnants of its power, but could no longer extinguish the sparks of a new era, the sparks of freedom and reason. The last, final act of the Inquisition played out in Spain itself in 1826, becoming a tragic, muffled echo of a whole era. In the small town of Valencia, a simple teacher named Cayetano Ripoll was put on trial. He was an ordinary man who taught children to read and count, but in his lessons he dared to speak of reason, not just of God. Neighbors, schooled by centuries of denunciations, immediately began to whisper that he was an atheist, that he denied the church and its sacred laws. The Inquisition, though weakened to the extreme, was still breathing, clinging to life. He was seized, questioned in the old tribunal hall, where the dust of ages covered the stone walls. He stood firm, wouldn't bow to their words, wouldn't renounce his views, and this, of course, infuriated the judges. They accused him of atheism and blasphemy, charges that in those days already sounded like a chilling echo of a distant past. The verdict was harsh, predictable for the last fanatics. He was hanged in the square before a crowd that watched in silence and perhaps with belated understanding. This was the last execution of the Spanish Inquisition, its bloody finale. King Ferdinand VII, who reigned then, formally supported this court, but the world was changing rapidly, and even monarchs couldn't stop it. A few years later, in 1834, the Inquisition in Spain was officially closed, and its gruesome voice died out forever. Cayetano Ripoll became the last one whose life was cut short in its shadow, marking the final end of this bleak era. In Portugal, the Inquisition also left its gruesome mark, sometimes persecuting people even after their death. In the 1750s in Lisbon, there were trials of those who had been long since gone. One woman died in her village in 1754. She was a simple peasant woman, sewed clothes, raised children. During her life no one touched her, but after her death neighbors, as if swarming, began to whisper. They remembered that she sang strange songs, didn't go to church as often as she should have, and kept old books. Her family, of course, immediately fell under suspicion. Her son became a doctor, and her daughter married a Frenchman who, oh the horror, read forbidden texts. The Inquisition, unable to reach the living, decided to punish them. Through their deceased mother, in 1756 her grave was opened, her bones dug up and burned in the square. It was a gruesome, barbaric ritual, meant to disgrace the family, to show that even death wouldn't save you from their court. The crowd watched as the flames consumed the remains, and her children stood aside, gritting their teeth in helpless rage and sorrow. These stories from Mexico to Spain and Portugal, vividly paint the picture of the Inquisition's decline. In Mexico, clinging desperately to power, it judged for books that carried the ideas of freedom, but could no longer break the spirit of those who read them. In Spain, its last execution was just a weak, tragic echo of the past that quickly faded in the new age of enlightenment. In Portugal, it battered even the dead, but could no longer hold the living in fear. The Enlightenment, with its ideas of reason, science, and tolerance, like water, eroded its stone seemingly unbreakable foundations. The brave souls who fought against it were the ones who finally drove it into oblivion. The Age of Light vanquished the Age of Fire, and the Inquisition remained in the past, a grim cautionary tale that fortunately no longer haunts the living.